There's a red pen in my desk drawer that doesn't belong to me. It's a cheap one, the kind you'd find in a box of 40 at an office supply store, except the cap doesn't quite fit anymore because it's been taken on and off so many times over so many years that the plastic has worn soft at the threads. I have refilled the ink cartridge in that pen more times than I can count. I have never once thought about buying a new one. It sits in the top drawer of every desk I've ever had, in every apartment, in every city, and when people ask me why I don't just throw it away and buy a decent pen like an adult, I tell them it's sentimental, which is true, and I let them assume it means less than it does. He never touched me, not once, not in 12 years, not even by accident in a doorway. That's the part I need you to understand before anything else, because everything I'm about to tell you will sound, at certain points, like it's leading somewhere it never actually went. I've never told this story before. Not to my husband, not to my sister, not to the 2 friends I've kept since college who know almost everything else about my life. I'm telling it now because I think I finally understand it, and understanding a thing is different from being able to survive it while it was happening. And I want to get the order right, because the order is the only way any of this makes sense. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 34. I live in Brooklyn now, in an apartment with too many bookshelves and not enough wall space, with my husband Daniel and our 5-year-old, who has just started asking why I go quiet sometimes when I'm editing on the couch at night. I'm a senior editor at a publishing house you've probably heard of. The kind that puts out 3 or 4 books a year that actually change how people think, buried among 40 that don't. I've been doing this work for 13 years. I got my start at a small independent house in Chicago called Wexford and Vane, which doesn't exist anymore, not really. It was absorbed into a larger imprint 6 years ago, and the name survives now only as a line of very small type on a copyright page. I should start with how it began, because the order matters. If I tell you the end first, you'll misread everything that came before it. And I've spent long enough misreading it myself. I was 22 when I walked into Wexford and Vane for an entry-level editorial assistant position, 3 weeks after I'd graduated from a state school in Ohio with a degree that had prepared me for exactly nothing except reading closely and caring too much about semicolons. I was engaged already. Daniel and I had gotten together at 19, the unglamorous way, a shared chemistry lab, a shared broke college kid apartment 2 years later, a ring at 21 that I wore on a chain under my shirt for the first 6 months because we couldn't afford the resizing, and I was terrified of losing it down a drain. By the time I sat down across the desk from Thomas Wexford for my interview, the ring was on my finger, sized correctly, and I made sure it was visible. I don't know why I remember doing that so deliberately. I think some part of me, even then, wanted the fact of it stated plainly before anything else could begin. Thomas was 58. I know that now with certainty because I looked it up years later, though at the time I would have guessed anywhere from 50 to 65. He had the kind of face that didn't announce its age so much as accumulate it quietly, weathered but not tired. The face of a man who'd spent 3 decades reading manuscripts by lamplight and had made peace with what that does to your eyes. He co-founded Wexford and Vane in his early 30s with a business partner who died of a heart attack a decade before I arrived, which meant the Vane in the name was, by the time I got there, just a ghost in the letterhead. Thomas never remarried after his divorce, which had happened sometime in the 90s, before my time, and which nobody in the office ever discussed in detail. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side that I would visit exactly once, years later, for reasons I'll get to. He hired me that same week over 2 more qualified candidates because, as he told me much later, in an offhand way that I turned over in my mind for years afterward, I had marked up my own Ursum's font choices in the margin of the printed copy I brought to the interview, as if I couldn't help myself. As if editing were an involuntary reflex rather than a job skill. He said that told him everything he needed to know. I started the following Monday. This is where I have to name the thing plainly, because if I don't, you'll spend the whole story waiting for me to say it, and I promised myself I'd tell this in order, without games. Thomas was my direct supervisor for the first 4 years. He was the most senior editor in the building. He decided which manuscripts I got to work on, whether I got promoted, whether my name ever appeared on an acquisitions memo, whether I had a career at all in an industry that runs almost entirely on who decides to give you a chance. And I was engaged to be married to another man the entire time I knew him. That is the axis this whole story turns on. Not a secret, not a slow reveal, but a fact that sat in the room with us from the very first week, plainly visible on my hand. In the way I talked about wedding venues at the office happy hour, in the save the date magnet that lived on my desk drawer for 2 years before I finally got married. He knew. Everyone knew. Nothing about what came after was built on concealment. It was built, instead, on the strange fact that a truth everyone acknowledged out loud somehow still left room for something neither of us ever said. The ritual started in my second month. Thomas had a standing habit of staying late on Thursdays to go through the week's slush pile himself, a task he could easily have delegated, but never did, because he said the whole business would die the day editors stopped reading the bad manuscripts themselves. I stayed late that first Thursday because I had nowhere better to be and a stack of contracts to finish, and he wandered past my desk around 7 with 2 coffees from the shop downstairs. He'd bought 2 out of habit, he said, before he remembered he was alone, and would I want the extra? I said yes. That was the whole beginning. No plan, no design, just a man with an extra coffee and a habit of not wasting things. By my 4th month, it wasn't a coincidence anymore. Every Thursday, around 6:30, he'd appear at my desk with 2 coffees, his black, mine with too much cream, which he'd learned within the first 3 weeks and never had to ask again. And we would sit on either side of the long table in the back conference room, him reading the slush, me reading whatever manuscript I'd been assigned that week, and periodically one of us would slide something across the table for the other to look at. 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. It became the architecture of my week before I noticed it had become the architecture of my week. He gave me the red pen in my 3rd month, the same pen that's still in my desk drawer 12 years later. Mine had run out of ink during one of those Thursday sessions, and I'd been reduced to marking a manuscript in pencil, which he apparently found intolerable, because, without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a spare, and set it down next to my hand without looking up from his own page. I meant to give it back the following week. I don't know why I didn't. I don't know why he never asked for it. He had a phrase he used constantly during those sessions. One that became something like a private language between us, before I understood it was becoming that. Whenever I'd fall in love with a sentence, really fall for it, the way you do when you're young, and every clever turn of phrase feels like proof of your own talent, and try to build the rest of the paragraph around protecting it, he'd tap the page with 2 fingers and say, without looking up, cut what you love first. He meant it as craft advice. Sentimentality is the enemy of good prose, he'd say. If you can't bear to cut something, that's usually the surest sign it needs to go, because you've stopped serving the piece and started serving your own attachment to it. I understood it as craft advice for a very long time. I want to be honest about how long. It was years before I heard it any other way, and even now I'm not certain he meant it any other way. Not consciously, not in the moment he first said it, but he said it to me more than to anyone else in that office, and he said it most often on the nights when the conversation had drifted somewhere it hadn't drifted before, when we'd finished the manuscripts and were still sitting there anyway, talking about nothing in particular. The coffee's long since gone cold, and there was the walk to the train. His apartment was on the north side. The Blue Line stop nearest the office was in the opposite direction from his building entirely. I checked this once, on a map, months in, and confirmed what I'd already half suspected, that walking me the 6 blocks to my platform added closer to 25 minutes to his commute, rather than none. He did it every Thursday night, regardless. He'd stand on the platform with me, not saying much, sometimes nothing at all, until my train pulled in, and then he'd nod once and turn and walk the 6 blocks back the way he'd come, and I would watch him through the train window until the platform curved out of sight. I never asked him to do this. I never told him it wasn't necessary. I looked forward to it in a way I didn't examine closely for a long time, the way you don't examine a habit that feels essentially harmless. I want to tell you about the first time someone else noticed, because it's important, and because it's the first time I had to look directly at what I'd been letting stay soft focus in my own mind. It was my coworker Priya, about a year and a half in, an assistant in production who sat 2 desks over and had the kind of directness I both admired and dreaded being on the receiving end of. We were getting drinks after a launch party, and she asked me, apropos of nothing, whether Thomas walked every assistant to the train or just me. I laughed and said he was old-fashioned. She said, not unkindly, that old-fashioned men don't usually clock the extra 20 minutes for people they're not attached to. I told her it wasn't like that. She said she wasn't saying it was like anything. She was just asking a question, and then she let it go. Because Priya was good like that, she never pushed past the point where pushing would have been cruel. But I thought about her question for weeks afterward. I thought about it on the platform the following Thursday, watching him standing there in his coat with his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular, and I thought, what would I even call this, if I had to call it something? And I didn't have an answer, and the not having an answer felt at the time like its own kind of honesty. I wasn't hiding anything. I genuinely didn't know. In my own head, over those years, I built a few private theories about what it was. Theories I never spoke aloud to anyone, not even to myself in words I'd have been willing to defend. One theory was that he was simply lonely, and I was a convenient, safe repository for a kind of attention he had nowhere else to put. Safe precisely because I was engaged, because the whole thing had a built-in ceiling that meant neither of us ever had to find out what would happen if it didn't. Another theory, one I trusted less and clung to more, was that he saw something in me worth investing in professionally, and the personal warmth was simply what happens when 2 people spend 2 years of Thursday nights in close proximity. That I was flattering myself by reading anything more into it. I held both theories at once, sometimes in the same week, and I never resolved them, because resolving them would have required a kind of scrutiny I wasn't ready to apply, not to him, and honestly, not to myself either. The moment I have to tell you about now is the one where the boundary got tested directly, because it's the clearest window into what this actually was, more honest than any of my theorizing. It was the spring of my 3rd year. I'd had a fight with Daniel, nothing catastrophic, the kind of fight engaged couples have about guest lists and money and whether his mother's opinions counted for more than mine, and I came into the office that Thursday distracted, quieter than usual, and Thomas noticed within the first 10 minutes the way he noticed everything about a page or a person if he was paying attention. And he was always paying attention. He didn't ask what was wrong. He waited until we'd gotten through the worst of the slush pile, and then he said, still looking at his own papers, that whatever was bothering me, I didn't have to talk about it if I didn't want to, but that he was there if I did. I told him, and I don't fully know why I told him, more than I'd told anyone else, including my own sister. The guest list fight, yes, but underneath it, the quieter fear that I was 24 and had never dated anyone but Daniel, and didn't know if that meant I was settled or just unpracticed at wanting anything else. He was quiet for a long moment after that. Then, he said something I've turned over more times than almost anything else he ever said to me. He said that he thought I was allowed to want things without that wanting meaning I had to act on them, that the two were not the same thing, and people spent their whole lives confusing them to their own detriment. And then he picked his pen back up and returned to the manuscript in front of him, and the conversation was over, cleanly, deliberately, like he'd said exactly as much as he intended to say, and not one word more. I sat there for a minute, not moving. Then I picked my pen back up too. Neither of us mentioned it again. That was the test, if you want to call it that, the moment where the door was open by an inch, where either of us could have said one more sentence and changed the entire shape of what this was, and instead we both, independently, without discussing it, chose to close it. I've thought about that choice for 10 years. I still don't fully know which of us made it first. I need to tell you plainly what the obstacle actually was, because I don't want you thinking there was some external villain keeping us apart, some contrivance, a jealous rival, or a company policy against fraternization. There wasn't. The obstacle was smaller and more honest than that, and harder to argue with. I was engaged to a man I loved, imperfectly but genuinely, a man who would go on to become a good father and a steady partner, and someone I have never once regretted marrying, even now, even knowing everything I know. And Thomas was my boss, 16 years older than me. A man who, I understood only much later, from things other people told me after he was gone, had made a private promise to himself after his divorce that he would never again let his own life interfere with the shape of someone else's, having spent his marriage, by his own private account, doing exactly the opposite. Those were the real walls, not policy, not fear of scandal, just two people, each carrying a commitment that predated the other, each unwilling to be the reason it broke. Neither of us ever said this to each other directly, but it sat underneath the pen and the coffee and the walk to the train every single Thursday for years, as plainly as if it had been written on the wall of that conference room. I love Daniel. I want that said clearly and without qualification, because it's true, and because the rest of this story only makes sense if you understand that nothing about what I felt for Thomas ever asked me to stop being true. The Thursdays lasted 4 years, and then they stopped, not because anything went wrong, but because life did what life does, which is move forward whether or not you're ready for it to. I made senior assistant editor in my 4th year, which meant more travel, more late nights that had nothing to do with the slush pile, more meetings that pulled me out of the office on exactly the evenings that used to be ours. Around the same time, Thomas started handing off more of the acquisitions work to a younger partner he'd brought on, a decision he framed to the staff as succession planning, and which I understood, without him saying so, as something closer to slowing down. We still had lunch sometimes. He still walked me to the train on the rare Thursday that lined up the old way. But the ritual, as a ritual, dissolved gradually, the way rituals do. Not with an ending, but with a widening gap between occurrences, until one day you look up and realize you can't remember the last time it happened. Daniel and I got married that same year. In a backyard in Ohio, 40 guests, string lights, a Wexford and Vane fruit basket instead of a card from Thomas because he said he'd never been any good at cards and didn't want to embarrass himself trying. I noticed the absence of anything more personal and told myself it meant nothing. I want to be honest that I noticed it all, that some part of me had been watching for a gesture, a line, anything, and cataloged its absence the way you catalog the absence of a word you were listening for in a song. I left Wexford and Vane 2 years after that for a position in New York, a real promotion. The kind you don't turn down for sentimental reasons. Thomas took me to lunch the week before I left, not the conference room, an actual restaurant, the first and only time in 5 years we'd eaten a meal somewhere other than that back table. He gave a short toast with his water glass, said the kind of things a mentor says to a proc moving on, proud of you, they're lucky to have you. Don't let New York editors bully you out of your instincts. And none of it was more than a boss should say to an employee he respected. At the end of lunch, he shook my hand. Not a hug. A handshake. Firm. Brief. The same handshake he'd given me the day he hired me. I remember thinking, on the walk back to the office alone, that the handshake felt like a decision, like he was drawing a line under the whole thing deliberately, giving us both a clean place to stop. I told myself that was a mature and appropriate way for it to end. I also cried in a stairwell for 4 minutes before going back to my desk, which I never told anyone, and which I did not examine too closely at the time, because examining it would have required calling it something, and I still didn't have a name for it. We stayed in touch the way people do when neither wants to be the one to let it lapse entirely, and neither is willing to make it more than it was. A holiday card each December, his handwriting getting smaller and more careful year over year in a way I didn't think much about until later. An email when I got promoted again. 3 lines, no exclamation points, just, heard the news, not surprised. Hope New York is treating you the way you deserve. Nothing that would have looked like anything to anyone reading over my shoulder. During those years, I told myself a specific story about what Thomas had been to me. A mentor. A formative professional relationship. A slightly old-fashioned man who'd been kind to me during a formative stretch of my 20s. Nothing more complicated than gratitude. It's a story I believed sincerely. I want to be clear about that, because what's coming will make it sound like I'd secretly known better the whole time, and I don't think that's true. I think I'd made myself believe the smaller version because the smaller version was livable, and the larger one, whatever the larger one was, wasn't something I had any use for as a married woman building a life 3 states away. Thomas died 4 years after I left Chicago. A stroke, sudden, at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon, found by the same younger partner he'd been grooming to take over the imprint. I found out from Priya, who'd stayed on at Wexford and Vane and still had my number. I flew back for the funeral. Daniel came with me. Understanding without my having to explain it in detail that this mattered more to me than a former boss's funeral should ordinarily matter, and not asking me to account for why. I remember almost nothing about the service itself. I remember the reception afterward in the function room of a hotel near the office more clearly than I'd like to. That's where his sister found me. Her name was Eleanor, older than Thomas by 3 years, a retired school teacher who'd flown in from Portland and who I'd met exactly once before at an office holiday party years earlier, where she'd struck me as sharp-eyed in the way certain older women are. The kind who watch a room instead of participating in it. She found me by the drinks table and introduced herself again, as though she suspected I wouldn't remember, though I did. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, the turnout, the weather, how strange it was that his desk still had his reading glasses on it, untouched, and then she said something that stopped the room, though her voice never rose above the volume of ordinary conversation. She said that Thomas had asked her, more than once over the years, to make sure that if anything ever happened to him, she would see to it personally that I received something from his estate, a specific object, not money. Nothing that would have looked strange in a will, but something he'd apparently set aside years earlier and updated the instructions on more than once. She said she hadn't thought much of it at the time he first asked, back when I still worked there, but that he'd repeated the instruction to her as recently as 18 months before he died, unprompted, during a phone call about something else entirely, which had struck her enough that she'd written it down. I asked her what it was. She said she didn't fully know herself, that Thomas had been specific about the instruction, but private about the reason. But that his lawyer had a sealed envelope with my name on it, along with a small parcel, and that she'd been planning to reach out to me about it before I left town. And wasn't it strange? Wasn't it just like him to make a production out of something and then die before he could hand it over properly? I met with the lawyer 2 days later, in a small office 3 floors up from a dry cleaner, Daniel waiting for me on a bench outside because I'd asked him to, gently. In a way, he understood, without needing an explanation. The lawyer, a tired, kind man in his 60s, who'd clearly known Thomas for decades, handed me a manila envelope and a small wooden box and told me Thomas had left specific written instructions that I open both alone, which was unusual enough that he felt obligated to mention it, and then he left the room to give me privacy I hadn't asked for, but was grateful for anyway. The box was small, the kind you'd keep cufflinks in. Inside it was a savings bond, made out in my name, purchased the year I started at Wexford and Vane, and added to, according to the paperwork clipped beneath it, every single year for the following decade, small amounts, never dramatic. The kind of contribution a careful man makes quietly and consistently, rather than in a single grand gesture. The total, by the time I sat there reading it, came to just under $40,000. There was a note clipped to the paperwork, in his handwriting, the same handwriting from the holiday cards, smaller now than it had been when he first gave me the pen. It said that he'd started the bond the year I told him, during one of our Thursday nights, that I was terrified of never being able to leave a bad situation because I'd made myself financially dependent on someone else's decisions, a fear I'd voiced once, in passing, about my mother's life, not my own, and which he had apparently listened to as though it were about me all along. The note said he hoped I would never need it for the reason he'd originally imagined, and that if I was reading this letter, it meant he hadn't been able to tell me himself that it existed, which he said he regretted, though not enough, he admitted, to have told me while he was alive, because he'd never quite found a version of that conversation that didn't risk changing something he'd decided not to risk changing. I sat in that office for a long time, I don't know how long enough that the lawyer knocked gently to check on me before I called out that I was all right. I want to render the conversation I had with Eleanor 3 days later exactly as it happened, because it's the moment the truth actually got said aloud, plainly. For the only time in this entire story, we met for coffee before my flight back to New York, at her request. She told me she wanted to say something to me that she'd decided not to say at the reception, in front of other people. She said that she'd asked Thomas once, years ago, directly, whether there was something between him and his young editorial assistant. She used those words, young editorial assistant, not my name, though we both knew who she meant, and that he had not denied it the way she'd expected him to. He had said, instead, that there are people you meet who show you a version of care you didn't know you were capable of, and that the cruelest and most honest thing you can do with that kind of feeling, when it arrives at the wrong time, in the wrong shape, is to make sure it costs the other person nothing. She said he told her he'd rather she never know exactly what he felt than know it and have it complicate a life he had no right to complicate. She said she'd argued with him about that once, told him it was a form of cowardice dressed up as nobility, and that he'd simply said he could live with being wrong about that. But he couldn't live with being the reason my marriage started with a shadow in it. I didn't cry in front of Eleanor. I want you to know that, because I think it matters, not because I was holding myself together out of pride, but because what I felt in that moment wasn't the kind of grief that needs an audience. It was quieter than that. It was the specific, disorienting sensation of an entire decade rearranging itself in real time. Every Thursday night, recalibrating its meaning, while I sat perfectly still holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand. There's a scene I have to go back to now, because it's the one that changed shape most under the weight of what Eleanor told me. The fight with Daniel, the third-year spring, the night Thomas said I was allowed to want things without acting on them. I'd carried that sentence for a decade as pure wisdom, generalized, the kind of thing a wise older mentor says to any young person in distress. Sitting in that coffee shop with Eleanor, I understood it differently. He hadn't been describing a principle. He'd been describing himself, out loud, in the only language he'd allow himself to use. He was telling me what he was doing, in real time, and calling it advice, so that neither of us would have to call it anything else. And the red pen. I thought about the red pen on the flight home, turning it over without realizing I'd taken it out of my bag, and I understood, for the first time, why he'd never asked for it back. A man who tracked a savings bond down to the dollar for a decade, who remembered how I took my coffee after 3 weeks and never had to ask again, does not forget a pen. He let me keep it, because keeping it cost him nothing, and meant, I think, something he never had a way of saying directly, a small object moving from his hand into my life permanently, disguised as an accident. The last motif was the phrase itself, "Cut what you love first." I'd used it my entire career since, taught it to every assistant I've ever trained, always crediting it to an old boss of mine without further detail. On the flight home from Chicago, I thought about how many times he'd said it to me specifically on the nights when the conversation had drifted somewhere unplanned, how it had always arrived like a hand gently closing a door that had for a moment been open. I don't think he meant it, originally, as anything but craft advice. I think it became something else between us, the way most things between us became something else. Not through intention, but through repetition, until an ordinary sentence was carrying more weight than either of us had assigned it on purpose. I want to be careful here, because I promised myself, telling this story, that I wouldn't resolve the uncertainty just because it would feel better to. Even now, with the bond and the note and Eleanor's account of that one direct question she'd asked him, I don't know with total certainty what Thomas felt, or when he started feeling it, or whether the word for it was the word I've been circling this whole time without saying outright. I have his sister's memory of one conversation. I have a note written in careful, aging handwriting that speaks around the thing rather than through it. That's not nothing. But it's not a confession, either, and I think he intended it that way. A decade of care, offered generously and specifically, with the actual naming of it withheld right up until the moment it stopped being able to cost anyone anything. There was no conversation with him, obviously. He was already gone by the time any of this became clear to me, and that absence is its own kind of mercy and its own kind of loss, both at once. The direct conversation that finally named the truth aloud was the one I've already told you, with Eleanor. Over coffee. 3 days after the funeral, I asked her, near the end of it, whether she thought I should have known sooner, whether there had been a version of those years where I could have seen it clearly while he was alive and done something, anything, differently. She thought about it for a while before she answered. She said she didn't think he would have wanted that, and that even if he would have, it wasn't a question I got to resolve on his behalf now, only a question I got to sit with. She said the kindest thing I could do with what I now knew was let it be exactly as complicated as it actually was, instead of flattening it into either a tragedy or a romance, because it had never fully been either. I flew home to New York that night. Daniel picked me up from the airport, and in the car, somewhere over the bridge, with the skyline going by, he asked, gently, how the trip had been, and I told him, honestly, that I'd learned something about my old boss that I was still trying to understand, and that I might need some time before I could talk about it properly, and he said, without pressing, that he'd be there when I was ready. He still doesn't know the full shape of it. I've thought many times about whether to tell him everything I've told you tonight, and I've decided, at least for now, that I won't. Not out of guilt, and not because I think there's anything to hide, but because some things belong to the person who lived them and the people who witnessed them. And telling Daniel wouldn't clarify anything for him. It would only ask him to carry a version of my life that was never his to carry. What I did do, in the months after, was deposit that savings bond, all $40,000 of it, into an account I opened specifically to fund a scholarship, A small one, modest, given out once a year through a foundation connected to my old university, for a first-generation student pursuing a career in publishing. The kind of student who might not otherwise get the chance to be seen the way I was seen by a man who decided, for reasons that were entirely his own, that my potential was worth investing in quietly, without asking for anything back. I named it after Wexford in vain, not after Thomas specifically. I thought about naming it after him directly, and decided against it because I think he would have hated the attention, and because some part of me wanted his name to stay exactly where he'd always kept it, in the margins, doing its work without announcing itself. I still have the pen. It's in my drawer right now, actually, 3 feet from where I'm sitting, half a world and 12 years away from that back conference room. I refilled it again last month. I don't know if I'll ever stop. I think about restraint differently now than I did before any of this happened. I used to think of it as a kind of failure, the thing that happens when two people run out of courage, or time, or the right circumstances. The sad version of a story that should have gone somewhere else. I don't think that anymore. I think restraint, done honestly, the way he did it, is its own complete act, not a smaller version of something else. It doesn't need to resolve into anything to have been real. Some of the fullest things I've ever felt were things that never had anywhere to go. And I used to think that made them lesser, and I don't think that anymore. I think it just made them what they were, whole in themselves, asking nothing of the years that came after. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.